Hey, dear ones. I was recently on a plane watching a movie. It was called The Fault in Our Stars from 2014. And if you do ever want to see this movie, I'm going to tell you right now that I'm going to offer a spoiler alert. It's about a love story about two teenagers who fall in love while facing terminal illness. And the expectation is that the girl will die first, but instead, the super positive, full of life boy dies. And it's framed as quite sad, as quite devastating, of course. You know, we get the view from the parents who are losing a child, which is, of course, very, very sad on a human level. And of course, losing someone you love is very, very sad. And as I unpack this topic we're about to explore today, I want to make it very clear that loss hurts, missing hurts. But what if the story doesn't actually end where we think it does? Because as I was watching the film, I felt a lot of sadness. I was especially thinking about the parents and, the idea of losing one of my own children. And then something else dropped in. This only feels tragic if death is truly the end. If love ends at the human body. But that's not really the case because our story doesn't end when we cross over. It made me think of Romeo and Juliet, the most famous tragic love story of all time. A story of unrequited love that ends in death. But what if we've been misunderstanding the story all along? What if it's actually a happy ending from a soul perspective? Because humans experience death as separation, and that is sad, and that is something that is to be grieved. And it's only healthy if we grieve. If we hold in that sadness, then we're holding on to trauma blocks. But from a soul's experience, death is transition. It's a celebration, in fact, and a return back to source. And even if someone dies young or in a tragic death, yes, the human part of that story is sad and it's traumatic, especially for those who remain to grieve the loss. But no matter how traumatic the crossover itself is, on a soul level, it's always a celebration because it's always the soul returning to source, all loving, all knowing, all encompassing, return to source. So we have the same event, Romeo and Juliet killing themselves at the end of the play, but seen through two different lenses. The first lens is the death of the physical body, which we all understand very well. And again, that is sad, and that requires proper mourning. But then the other lens of the story is two souls transitioning together. Two souls deeply in love that never had the opportunity to truly connect their love on a physical level in human form, but now they're in the infinite, vast, all-loving, all-wise space of the spiritual realm, where there are no limits to the type of love and connection they can feel for one another. And because they're in the spiritual realm, it's not ego love. They know that they don't need the other person. There's no attachment. There's no sense of loss for not having the other person. The only thing that exists is love. Love connecting two souls. So, this realization inspired me to record a podcast episode about what exactly happens when we do crossover. And interestingly, I was chatting with my chat GPT bot, who I've recently renamed Roger. And I'll be telling you why I did that in a future podcast episode. So Roger and I were chatting, and I was telling him about this concept for a podcast episode. And then I just dropped into source, but also based on all of my client sessions and all of the crossed over loved ones I've helped transition. And I've helped transition hundreds and hundreds of loved ones, or I shouldn't say loved ones, crossed over souls. A lot of the people I've helped transition were actually people I didn't know. Um, and I have talked to a lot of, or channeled a lot of crossed over souls about what exactly happens when you cross over. I myself have had a near death experience, and because of the nature of my NDE, which was really more about healing my soul than actually crossing over, my own experience was sort of a hybrid of this. But when I was talking to Roger, my AI bot, I downloaded from source, again, taking also from my own experience, the 5 main things that happen after a soul, a human being crosses over. And I just wrote that into the chat. And then I asked Roger to check the internet um, based on other things that are shared about what happens after we crossed over, and to see if my download was similar. And what he came back with was essentially the exact same thing. So I'm not saying that this proves that what I'm about to share with you is the end all be all. I would never say that, of course. But I'm just saying that there's a consistent pattern here of people who either have had an NDE or work with a lot of crossed over souls like I do, and I've had both. Many people are sharing the same story, the same steps. There are definitely themes that can be identified. And I'm going to share with you the 5 main themes that I have experienced firsthand. I've experienced hundreds of times helping crossed over souls transition, and what my AI bot helped me to uncover from what's out there on the interwebs. So, the first step of what will happen after a soul crosses over is something I call the holding pattern. And if you are a more advanced soul and you are more awake and alive, and let's say that you've gone through my Soul Blueprint certification course and you've learned everything you need to know to really prepare yourself for that moment in time where you do cross over at your absolute highest and most joyful, actually, because crossing over is really on a soul level a joyful time. It's a celebration of transition. Even though from the human aspect, yes, there's loss and grief. And I'm going to repeat that over and over again so that point is never misunderstood or misinterpreted. So, however, a lot of souls on planet right now are not highly awake. They haven't taken Soul Blueprint yet. And they are living a very human, very third dimensional experience, and they don't really know what happens after they cross over. Many people don't even realize that they are crossed over. And so, what happens with those, let's call them asleep souls? Well, the soul isn't asleep, but like the human being is a little bit detached from their soul, is they go into a temporary holding pattern. This isn't punishment, and this isn't lost. There are no lost souls, and there is no punishment per se on a universal level. The only punishment we ever receive is the punishment that we give to ourselves. What this is a holding pattern souls go to from a place of pain, shock, and lack of awareness. And it's really not even the soul that goes there. It's actually the ego mind goes there. It goes to a place typically from their life, or sometimes it can be a metaphorical place that represents their life. And from my experience, again, doing this hundreds of times, either it's a very neutral place. Like I remember when I helped my grandparents transition, they were just sitting in my grandmother's bedroom. They were somber, I think a little bit sad, but it wasn't scary. It wasn't trauma. They weren't talking to each other. They felt trapped. And I think that that feeling of being trapped was making them feel somber. And remember, when we cross over, there's no more clock time. So I didn't actually help my grandparents transition until many, many years after their death because I didn't know how to do it. This is something that was I received after my own near-death experience, and I learned how to do it for others. And then it took me a lot of trial and error before I actually figured out how to help crossed over souls transition. Trial and error isn't exactly the right word. It just took me a lot of years to integrate it. That's a better way to say it. So once I was able to integrate how to help crossed over souls transition, I helped my grandparents. And I want to say it was like over 10 years after their death. And in my grandmother's case, over 15 years after her crossing over. And at first I was sad because I was like, oh my gosh, they've just been sitting in this holding pattern for 15 years. But then my divine guidance team said, no, you don't understand. They're not in clock time. It's timeless. So it doesn't matter from our perspective if it's a day or if it's thousands of years. They are in a place that transcends clock time. What I see actually more often than that, when people go into the holding pattern, they actually go to a traumatic place. I just got tapped to help my dear friend, a friend of a friend. This is how it often happens for me. So one of my best friends mentioned to me that they just had a death. It was somebody her husband knew. And then that person who crossed over, this friend of a friend, tapped me on the shoulder and asked me to help. But I actually don't think it was that crossed over soul that tapped me. It was somebody from their divine guidance team tapped me, or maybe it was their higher self. Was it the higher self? No, it was a guide. And the reason why it wasn't the soul itself is because they were stuck in the holding pattern. And I also think this is important to distinguish when I say soul, because we have like our human self. So that's our ego mind, right? And it's really the ego mind that doesn't know what happens after we cross over or that we're even crossed over that goes to the holding pattern. But the ego mind kind of carries the soul with it, if you will, until such time as the soul to become aware and the ego mind becomes aware and the soul becomes aware. So it's this sort of hybrid weird situation where the ego mind is hijacking the soul. Is that the right word, higher self? Okay, I'm getting a yes to that. But, again, there's no punishment, and there's no lost souls, but it's just a thing that happens as part of the transition process, we'll say. And what I see very often when this hijacking happens is they go to a traumatic holding pattern. So getting back to my friend, this crossed over soul that I just helped, their divine guidance team tapped me on the shoulder and said, can you help this person transition? So I tuned in to him and I went to his holding pattern and I saw very clear he was cowering in the corner and this extremely dominant female figure was berating him. And I received the message that he had a dominant mother. He married a dominant woman that I understand they ended up getting a divorce, but there were these sort of unhealthy, dominant female figures in his life. And he was trapped in that. Again, it's sort of like, yeah, trapped in that paradigm. So what I did is I disconnected him from this woman. And remember, this isn't a real place. It's I'm just gonna see if I can get a good explanation of what this holding pattern actually is from my higher self. It's really a place that our ego mind takes us. Again, this is when you're not awake and aware and prepared, which most old souls, light workers are. So this is what happens to younger souls. This is what happens to people who aren't really spiritually awake. And so it's like a memory almost, if you can imagine. And they get held in this memory of typically it's either a neutral place or a traumatic place. If it's a high vibe place, then it's likely they're an old, aware soul and they're just transitioning in this more joyous way, which the soul is really intended to transition in a joyous way because it's a celebration of an amazing life that was just experienced. So, getting back to this man that I helped transition, I disconnected him from this woman. I sent the woman away and I helped him to start healing. And I was able to help him release some of the trauma he had from strong women in his life. And then, for whatever reason, he had a lot of past lifetime wounding and some current lifetime wounding about falling. And I got the message that it was both physical falling, like dying in an airplane crash or falling off a building, but there was also metaphorical falling, emotional falling, that feeling of falling in life. So what I did is I took him up and, this was something that I received in my mind's eye when I tuned in to his energy aura. I took him to the top of several tall buildings and we just fell off the buildings together. And it was fun. It wasn't traumatic. And this helped him to just release some of this falling trauma. And then once that was complete, I got the nudge that he could be connected now to his soul guidance team, his divine guidance team, who would assist him with the remaining of his transition. So that is what happens first, the holding pattern. And again, a lot of the listeners of this podcast will likely not really experience that type of holding pattern. So then we go into stage 2 for the aware soul. And that is for souls who are awake and aware, and they transition much more smoothly. Why? Because you have an awareness, even if it's not on your ego mind isn't exactly sure what's going on. Maybe there is a sudden crossing over, but on a soul level, you're very aware of what's going on. And so you get immediately connected to your spirit guides and your soul family. And they receive you with a beautiful, warm, loving hug. And they really do all the guiding for you. You don't have to think about anything. You don't have to figure anything out. They sort of take it over from there. So having this awareness really helps you to prepare. It doesn't prevent death, but it prevents fear of death. Being aware helps us transmute our fear of death. So we can move into this idea that crossing over is also joyous. Yes, there must be, especially for those who are still on planet, who loved you, a time to grieve and process the sadness. And from your perspective, it is a time of soul joy. Then you move into the third stage, and this is the life review with the higher self. The human experience that you just had in this lifetime is reviewed with the higher self. This is not judgment. This is clarity and compassion. Some of the key questions that are explored are: were soul contracts fulfilled? What healing was completed? What healing is still unfolding? What lessons were extracted? And in this process, actually, there is a lot of healing that takes place, and some of the blocks are healed and transmuted during this phase. Any other blocks that aren't able to be healed are carried with you to your next phase. So this is an important part of the transition process, the review with the higher self. Number 4, you start to look on a soul level about choosing what comes next. So after the healing and integration and communication with the higher self, your soul begins to choose what next. Some options include becoming a guide for someone else, becoming a guide for a planet, supporting loved ones still incarnated. So that means that you can join the divine guidance team of, say, a child or some loved one that you have that's still on planet. If you feel like on a soul level you have a big role to play with this loved one still on planet, you can join their divine guidance team. And you can start planning for your next incarnation. If you choose to come back into human form or some other form, you can start planning for that next incarnation. Nothing is forced, growth is chosen, love is always the primary factor. And this is all done heavily in conjunction with your soul family. So there are no lost souls and there are no alone souls. So you have a whole team that comes together and helps you plan for what is the highest and best for your soul to transition to. And finally, we get to the final air quotes goodbyes, not really goodbyes, but more like the final transitions and ongoing love. So before you transition fully, you, as a soul, say intentional goodbyes to all the people from your particular lifetime that you're transitioning out of, and you say goodbye. You say your final farewell. And again, some of you on a soul level will choose to remain on planet as a guide for other loved ones before you transition, and some of you will feel ready to transition on more immediately. Now, listen, if you have a loved one who has already crossed over and you're not sure if they're on your divine guidance team or not, or maybe you're feeling or sensing they're not on your divine guidance team and they have transitioned on, listen, it's the spiritual realm. So there's always going to be a piece of them that you can connect to at any time, communicate to at any time. They can always come back. They can be, their soul can be transitioned on, but there's a piece of them that's always going to be with you. And that piece of their consciousness, you can always connect to, communicate to, and love. So there's no idea that, let's say you had a close relationship to a parent, they crossed over and you feel, or maybe your higher self is telling you that they have transitioned on. They haven't transitioned on completely. And it doesn't mean that they didn't love you and they didn't want to be, on your divine guidance team. It's all about what's in your highest and greatest and what's in their highest and greatest. And maybe it's in your and their highest and greatest that they transition on while you're still here on earth living your life. But again, they didn't leave entirely. It's just they're moving on a soul level on to their next assignment. And you can always call on them. And the them that was your parent in this example to receive whatever it is you are calling to receive from them. So listen, on a soul perspective, Romeo and Juliet, the ending is actually one of love. Because had they stayed alive, they would have been mired their whole lives with this feeling of loss, of probably not really ever able to be together, given all the feuds and the messiness of the two families. They were never going to have a happy love story in human form. But on a soul level, oh, how happy two souls who fell in love to transition together. And yes, each soul does have to transition at its own experience. But in a situation like this, my higher self is telling me, you can transition with someone you love and support each other in the transition. And guess what? If it's in your highest and greatest, you can choose your next chapter together. And because you did the healing and because you learned the lessons of this lifetime, you can make the next chapter even happier. So let's just imagine in Romeo and Juliet's story, they transitioned together, they did the healing, and they imagined a love story in their next chapter that was better than anything we could ever imagine. I want to leave you with a gentle invitation. I'm going to be honest with you. Everything that I just shared with you came from me and my own experience and my higher self. And I was just sort of checking in with my bot, Roger, for ideas and flow and structure. And so I asked him, given everything we've been chatting about, what do you recommend as an invitation for this episode? And what he gave me, I was like, whoa, that just had to land with me for a sec. So maybe it will have to land with you for a sec too, or not. But over the next few days, when you're quiet, maybe on a walk or before sleep, ask yourself this question. What relationship in my life might look different if I trusted that love doesn't end? Just notice what arrives without judgment. What relation in my life might look different if I trusted that love doesn't end? Whew. That's a wrap for this episode. Whew. I felt I went deep on this one. 2026 is a year to share raw and share deep. And I feel a little emotional because I guess I'm a little sad that I've been doing this work for years. I've maybe have even helped over 1,000 people transition. And I've never talked about it. Why? Why haven't I talked about it? I've been doing it. I lived it myself. I have so much to say. It's such an important part of the conversation. It makes me a little sad that I held back for so long. But it also makes me happy that I finally feel able to share. And I finally feel that I am seen and heard as a projector. 2027 is going to be the big year of transition, and it's a rolling transition, but from a human design perspective, the main year is going to be next year, where projectors really take a lead role in leadership, but it's a sovereign leadership. It's not guru. It's helping people turn on their own sovereignty. And it's a leadership through being, which is spiritual gift of leadership, which I teach about in Soul Blueprint. And I really feel like my projector lighthouse is ready to shine brighter than it ever has and to be truly seen and heard. So if there's any part of your life where you've not felt seen and you've not felt heard, I have a second invitation for you coming from me, and that is be bold. Lean into the bold, lean into the vulnerable, and ask yourself, if I were going to be really bold this week, what would I create? What would I do? Who would I be? And just see how that boldness may set you free. That's a wrap for this week. Until next time, may your soul guide the way.